introductions at home. So welcome everyone to St. Stephen's University, to this reading and forum with David Adams Richards, Sharon Thira, and facilitated by Joel Mason. So the title of the evening is New Brunswick, Hard Luck, Hockey, and Hope. And that is the theme that Sharon and David will be speaking to this evening. Sharon has been a wonderful friend of St. Stephen University. Last spring she came to give a workshop on residential schools, and many staff, faculty, and students were just incredibly enriched by that workshop. Not only your content, Sharon, but just the interaction that you facilitated there. So thank you very much. Joel Mason is a musician, a writer of science fiction and poetry, and a very creative thinker. We really appreciate you being here tonight, Joel. And Joel's part of a lab, and I'm not entirely understanding of how the whole thing works. I don't have my notes. However, he's also here representing Dialogue New Brunswick, which is a grassroots organization that seeks how to innovate municipal structures in creative ways, find ways out of dead ends that we find ourselves in. So thank you, Joel, for being here. David Adams Richards is a senator in the Senate of Canada. He has been a writer for over 40 years, writing fiction, nonfiction. He's one of the 3 writers in Canada who's won the Governor General's Award for both fiction and nonfiction. If you read his fiction, it's very cold often in his stories. And so many of his stories include characters who are actually left out in the cold. And that's a huge concern of his fiction. David David has looked to Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Also, there was another one, and I'm sorry, I forget.
Just make one up.
You need an imagination. So we're thankful for the 3 of you to facilitate tonight, and really look forward to your thoughts. So would you welcome with me David Adams Richards.
I was here today. I had a reading. I'm kind of all read out, so I don't think I'll read tonight. I have my hockey book. I could read the whole hockey book. I love hockey. I'll get rid of the hockey first. I love hockey. And I'm going to read an essay about Wayne Gretzky, okay? And then I can talk about my grandmother. There is a connection because it all has to do with hockey in New Brunswick and stuff. And I just thought of it. I've never read this essay before. Anybody?
Does this mean you're an Oilers fan?
What's that?
Does this mean you're an Oilers fan?
No, it means I'm a Canadian fan. Oh, stop. I'm a Catholic from New Brunswick. What the hell else would I do? I thought you guys knew Canada. I guess not. Anyway, I gotta find this. It's all about Wayne Gretzky. Wayne Gretzky, as my son when we were in Spain used to say. Wayne Gretzky. We used to play on the porch in Spain, hockey, because it was in the Turbot War. Anyone remember the Turbot War that happened between Spain and Canada? Remember that? For 20 years I was telling Peggy they've got to do something about overfishing off the Grand Banks. The time they did it, I was in the country they did it to. Oh, it was wonderful. So we stayed at home. and we played hockey on the porch. And Monty, who was the Spanish girl that was next door, and she had two little boys, and Thomas and someone else, I forget the name. And the first thing she ever said to me was, "David, you have permission to beat my children." I said, "I won't beat your children." After 10 minutes with them, I knew exactly what. Yeah. But anyway, I didn't beat them. But anyway, I want to tell you something. She, right in the heart of the Turbot War, we couldn't go anywhere, and we played our hockey out on the porch, and John, who was 4, would be Wayne Gretzky, and I'd be everyone else. And Peggy was in the net. And one night a knock comes on the door, it's 11 at night. A knock comes on the door, and we open the door, and Monty is there with a Team Canada hockey stick. Left too, shoots left, which we all did. And he sent away to Switzerland and got it for us. And it was the kindest thing that was ever done. Yeah. And she had a friend visit her, and I said to the friend, "How long are you going to stay?" And her friend said, "I'm not sure, because my how do you say, an ex-husband says he see me again, he will kill me." I said, "Well, you better stay here then." So God bless her. We've never seen those people again, but they were friends of ours back then. Anyway, this is Gretzky. Called Gretzky Gave Us Everything He Had. He has had many nomenclatures, the great one, Gretz, number 99, the Wainer, and on occasion the Whiner. I was in my early 20s when I heard that a kid from Brunswick was going to be greater than Bobby Orr. I didn't want to believe it. I'm not sure why. In a way, hearing how many goals he has scored in 1 year, about 1,500, was like hearing about the Krupp cannon in the 1870s. Which, since it fired accurately up to 4 times the distance of any other cannon of its time, couldn't be for real, and therefore was hard to sell to the Prussian Army chiefs of staff. In many ways, Gretzky was a hard sell. I was part of those who waited to be convinced, for he was the antithesis of what a hockey player looked like. He was too small, supposedly didn't skate that well, supposedly again had no shot, looked awkward, didn't really mix it up. So many of the greats looked better on skates, were bigger, could take a shot, and had a mean streak. Bobby Orr, the only man who rivaled Gretzky for number 1, had a mean streak. And when he skated, my God. Gretzky had to quell every doubting Thomas. For a while there were thousands, maybe a million. If his holding 62 National Hockey League records is a legacy, his more lasting personal achievement is that. I don't think there can be any more question. He has answered them. Now looking back at it, it didn't even seem to be that hard to do. He has proven that no player born on any soil was greater. Still, it must have taken its toll. He has aged before our eyes. Much of the criticism wasn't even about hockey. There was something about his personality too. He was too clean, shy, and opinions seemed to be rehearsed. Yet he loved attention. Then he never got in trouble. There was always a bit of a danger about Messier, which was appealing. For some, Gretzky was too close to his father, and after he went to LA, he was seen to be mouthing the sentiments of the hockey commissioners to make the game more appealing to the Yanks. good for the game is a line I've always hated. The game in Canada was on the decline and Gretzky had gone south for the market, for the money. It was mentioned in the House of Commons as a national crisis, but 1,000 other players had gone south over the years, Hull and Howe and Orr, or was it just LA? We felt we didn't deserve that great a hockey player, but at one time they had Marcel Diaz. That is, our country has often given its national treasures away, bringing them home for the Order of Canada. Maybe we have no opinions or options anymore. But if we don't blame ourselves, we can't blame Gretzky. He stayed here longer than most. He also played some of the greatest games for Canada. I don't remember him ever saying no. I don't know when I began to change my opinion about him. I still love the way Lafleur moved and Mario played, Denny Savard, Doug Gilmour, and Pavel Bure too. But then again, there was only 199. One night watching the game back when he played for the Oilers, I suddenly sat up. He was there, and it was over. That is my feeling that I ever needed convincing anymore. It had dissipated in his move behind the net at center ice, and when he came out from the corner and found, without even looking, anyone he wanted to at any time with a pass, I was as close to watching perfection as I was likely ever going to be. I was alone with no one to shout about it with. He then, over 20 seasons, shattered all the records. I have delighted in his play for years, but saw him play on live only 5 times. The first was the second game against the Soviets in the 1987 Canada Cup, the one that went into double overtime. Even greater was his moment in the third game, coming back from a 3-0 and the pass to Lemieux with a minute left, or the 1991 Canada Cup when he seemed to handle the Swedes single-handedly. What to me was his greatest moment, the moment he made me proudest? I'll whisper it. It was when he sat alone on the bench after our loss to the Czechs in 1998. I realized at that moment, 5 o'clock on that morning, that in some truly ultimate way, he had given us everything he had. So how will we measure the man? We will measure him by what we refuse to forget after he is gone. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about my grandmother. I hope I don't get this water all mixed up for you. Somebody else come up and drink. Is this mine?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's yours.
My grandmother, my grandfather came from England in 1911, and he had a big plan, and the plan was to start in Halifax. He was a concert pianist. Start in Halifax, go across to Vancouver, go down to Seattle, go across to New York. By that time he'd be famous and play at Carnegie Hall. That was his big plan. He got to Newcastle and he had no one to accompany him on the violin. So he put an ad in the paper. And this 18-year-old girl showed up with a fiddle. Her name was Janie McGowan. And she said, and he said to her, can you read music? She said, no, but I can play anything you can. And their relationship was born that night. And they played for the silent films. They started a movie theater. And they played for the silent films. And he tried to enter the First World War, go back and fight for England. But he couldn't. There was something wrong with him. They didn't know what it was, but he wasn't in good health. By 1917, 18, they found out it was diabetes. And he was dying. And he lived till 1923. And he became a guinea pig at Banting and Best, because the Best, Mr. Best or Dr. Best, was married to a Crocker woman who lived just down the street from my grandparents. And so they took him to Montreal or wherever they were and tried to help him, but it was too late. And he died of 1923. Now my grandmother had 3 children and the theater business, and she decided to keep the theater. And men came and asked her to sell it to them. And she said, no, thanks, I'm gonna keep it for myself. And it was scandalous. Single widowed woman with 3 children keeping a theater, which is considered sinful anyway. And she decided to keep it. And so they got the bank manager to foreclose on her mortgage. And her bank manager was in debt to her opposition, with a gambling debt. And they said, if you want to get rid of this gambling debt, you foreclose on her mortgage. Because we want to take over, we don't want her as competition. So she left the bank that day with the $4,000 debt, and they said, if you don't pay it within 2 weeks, we're taking your theater. And she left the bank, and she said to the bank manager, you can't do that to people. It'll come back on you. You cannot do this to people. And she left. Now, she was a little urchin from Injuntown, which is actually Enginetown. And she was a little urchin from there. Her father was a stagecoach driver who lost his horses in a fire. And there was nobody in Injuntown who had the money to help her. So she went across the Morsey Bridge and went to a lumber baron who was a Protestant. Now at that time, you know the difference between Catholics and Protestants on the river or anywhere else. She had married a man from the Church of England, but he was the only Protestant she knew. All her relationships were Catholic. And she got the courage up to knock on that door. And he answered the door. His name was Burchell. He became a senator later. And she knocked on the door. He answered the door, and she said, they're going to take my business unless I get $4,000. He said, Janie, I'll loan you the money. So he loaned her the money. And she began to scrimp and save and pay the money back, but she kept her theater. And then 1928 came along. And when 1928 came along, she decided to do something quite reckless. And everyone thought she was nuts. She went to Montreal and she got the monopoly for 4 years on some silly thing called the talkies. And she put every theater in the area out of business. People could come from miles around to the talkies. And the business used to, they used to tear down our one sheets. And you know what one sheets are. One sheets are the advertisement for the movies. And she used to have them up on poles and around the town. And they used to tear them down. The guys used to hire young men to go out and tear her one sheets down. So she would leave the house, and my father, in the care of the other 2 children to my father, who was 5 years old. And she would take a large RCMP fast road, and dressed as a man, she would go and hide in the ditches. And when those sons of bitches came to tear her signs down, she would come up out of the ditch with a flashlight and knock them silly. And she knocked more than one man cold. She knocked the cow out with one punch. So she was a pretty tough lady. The only person that I know who did anything like that was Malcolm Lowry, the guy who wrote Under the Volcano, who knocked a horse out with one punch. Well, she knocked a cow out with one punch, so I think that's pretty good. And so they decided to blow her business up. So anyway, they were trying to blow her business up, and what they did was they hired guys to sneak in and plant dynamite on the hard rock maple that they were used to the fire in the winter. And so in 1930, they did that. And they put 4 sticks of dynamite on a piece of hard rock maple and wrapped it with tape. And John Walsh, my great uncle, was throwing wood in the fire. And he picked up this piece of wood and he started to throw it in. He saw it had a piece of tape, he turned around, there was 4 sticks of dynamite. So he laid it aside and kept loading the fire. And they didn't get to blow her up. And so she kept her business, and she became rather wealthy and reclusive and very bitter. and I can't blame her, and all three can. So you're talking about the New Brunswick experience. I don't know what the New Brunswick experience is. I couldn't stand up here and say what the New Brunswick experience is for anybody, but I can say I know what it was for me, and I know what it was for my grandmother. It's very strange because there's two incidents there. In 1952, the phone rang, and this woman was in Chatham, and she said, Janie, my husband's dying, and I have no money for the funeral. And Janie said, bury your husband and send the bill to me. And it was the bank manager that foreclosed on her mortgage. He had died in paupers. He had died in the paupers' house over in Chatham. He had spent his life gambling and lost his job and lost everything, except his wife who stuck with him. So that was one story. Another story was in 1972, I was having a beer in a tavern. I used to drink then. That's why I don't drink now. And I was having a beer, and this guy came in and said, can I buy you a beer? And I said, sure, why not? So he was an older man. He sat there and he bought me a beer. And I drank the beer, and he said, you're Janie's son. I said, no, I'm Janie's grandson. He said, grandson. Boys, time's passed, doesn't it? I said, yes, time does pass. And we drank a beer and we left. And the bartender came over and said, you know who that is? I said, no, I didn't. He said, that was one of the young men that were hired to blow your grandmother up. And with that beer, he was saying he was sorry. And I don't hold anything against him. So that's some of my experience with New Brunswick. It's a very strange thing because so many others have had a vastly different experience. I mean, many people have not known murderers. I drank with them half my life. I didn't know they'd commit murder, but I knew them. I grew up in an area where I knew people from every walk of life by the time I was 13. I knew prostitutes, and I knew refined ladies. I knew educated men, and I knew people who couldn't afford a meal. And I always loved the people who couldn't afford a meal more. I was always attracted to them more. I don't know why. It was no big charitable thing on my part. It was just that was the way it was. That was the way it was. But later on, when I went to university, I met some young ladies who considered themselves feminists. And they would come and they would say to me, you know, your grandmother was just like me. I'd say, why? Why was she just like you? Well, she was independent like me. They didn't have a clue. I mean, she wasn't independent like them. She had grade 6 education. She was a little urchin on the street. You know, she didn't march for Take Back the Nights. You know, she never marched for Take Back the Nights down the streets of Fredericton. You know, she had a flashlight hiding in a ditch. You know. So there is a difference. It's not a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind of thing about independence. That's why I love independence. Real independence is different than the kind of independence that is sometimes touted as being independent. That's a collective independence. To me, the individual is everything or the world is nothing. That's how I've always felt. And maybe I got it from my grandmother. I don't know. But my other grandmother was pretty tough too. And the men weren't bad either. You know. My other grandmother, they tried to take over her farm. So she got the shotgun out and she held them off at the barn. They hid at the barn, and she got her son to go through the woods for 2 days and find her husband, who was running a team of horses on a drive, and get him to come out and help her get rid of the men who were saying they were going to take over her farm. She couldn't wax elegantly about gun courses or gun safety. I mean, she had to protect her livelihood and her children. This is, to me, a difference in how independence works. Independence isn't some schooled or trained thought. It comes from a very basic human emotion of knowing who you are. It's not set out to hurt anybody, but it's just knowing who you are as a human being. And that's why both my grandmother and my grandfather, who set off across the street, across the ocean when he was 20 to become a concert pianist, are very important to me. That's why they're very important to me. I don't know if any of you have heard about the home children. The home children were put on boats and sent across to Canada or Australia because it was a problem people thought they could get rid of. Children were a problem they thought they could get rid of. And they still do that today in other means. But this problem that they could get rid of, people like little Emma Cook, at 4 years old, they gave her a little rag doll and sent her on a boat. Well, the woman talking to me that she was just like Janie missed the fact that Janie was more like little Emma Cook than she would ever be like this woman who was taking second year women's studies at University of New Brunswick. I'm sorry if that upsets people, but it makes me have to write the way I write. I can't write any other way. I can't say you know what you're talking about to somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. And that's why I guess I write about New Brunswick the way I do. And people said, you know, you write about, I'm almost done. People said you write about terrible, depressing, horrible, cold subjects. I've never written about a horrible, depressing, cold subject in my life, ever. I've written about human beings who are at times filled with such grace that they give their lives for people. I mean, what's cold or depressing about somebody giving their lives for other people? I don't think there's anything. I think people believe that if people don't have structured middle class virtue, then for some reason it's depressing. And maybe that's true, but I've never found it to be so. I'd rather have my grandmother cursing at me for bringing warm water when she wanted cold water to drink, and knowing that she still loved me, you know. And this young woman who said she was like my grandmother, my God, my grandmother's scared to death just by looking at her, you know. So all I'm saying is that the New Brunswick experience is magnificent. And my grandmother is just one small example of that magnificence, because there was 1,000 women like that. And whether they were French or English or First Nations, there was 1,000 women and 1,000 men like that. That's the New Brunswick experience. That's why I love New Brunswick. That's why I write about New Brunswick. And that's why I'll continue to. I can't solve the problems by writing about it, but I can write about its generosity and its greatness in spite of the problems we have. And that's all I'm trying to do. Thanks very much.
Standing behind a podium.
They do.
Oh, well, I think I have to for the microphone. So, thank you, David, so much. There was so much going through my mind as you were talking, and I appreciated your notion around the concept of independence. And you said that you've lived with independence, and that's what you write for. And of course, I come from a different tack. I take the completely opposite tack. I come from a community that's interdependent, and where the notion of who you are is defined by the people that are around you. And so these are two sides of a coin that are also part of the fabric of New Brunswick. I'm an outsider in New Brunswick. I've been here for 3 years, and so I know you all so well now. In my first year, I wasn't working, so I had my closest experience to hockey that I will have. I know absolutely nothing about hockey, but I spent some time in my first year trying to teach myself how to ice skate over at Garcelon, because they have free days on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and you can go and skate, and nobody is there. So this was a part of my essential New Brunswick experience, is falling flat on my face on the ice at Garcelon Centre. But in my trek over to this part of the world, I'm from Vancouver, I stopped off. I spent a year in Ganasonage, which is near Montreal, and it's a Ganyagahaga community, and that's where my partner's from, and so you know them as Mohawks, but they're Ganyagahaga. And I spent a year there, and my experience in that little rural area of Montreal was so oppressive that I almost lost a sense of who I was in being in that place. I would walk into a restaurant, and my partner and I, and he, many of you know him, he looks white, and when we would go into the restaurant together, we had people actually actively get up and move away from our table. The experience of racism there was really, really palpable. And having lived in Vancouver and in other parts of the west of Canada, it was such a jarring experience for me that I found that it was tearing me down. And I didn't have a sense of community. I didn't have the people around me who constructed my identity. This is a really different way of seeing yourself. And in terms of Western notions of identity construction, it's based on this idea that you have to become independent, that what you're trying to do, where you're trying to move towards, is to become independent and do things for yourself. Whereas in Indigenous communities, the goal is actually to move towards what you can do for other people. It's a balance of, and I've talked about this before, the idea of rights versus responsibilities. Because for Indigenous peoples, you have rights only as they are given to you based on fulfilling the responsibilities that you have in the place that you live. And so every time I come into a new land, into a new territory, one of the things that I do is I try to find the spirit of that place, and I try to figure out what it is that I'm responsible to and for in this new place that I'm stepping into. In doing that, in doing the ceremonies that I have to do, in doing the things that I have to fulfill, that's where I get the right to stand. That's where I get the right to have clean water. That's where I get the right to have food. It's a completely different way of seeing the world. And so for me, the struggle has always been stepping into a room. And at this moment in time, I want you to take just a quick minute with me and close your eyes. And picture who's around you, who's next to you, who's around you. What's their gender? What's their race? What's their religion? What's their height? What's their belief system? When you're done, you can open your eyes again. When you think about the people who are around you, are they very different from who you are? Not really. And so the experience for somebody like me, and I had it when I went over to dinner with at Agnes's house. She invited me over to dinner. When I stepped into the room,
I had this experience of being different at once in this collection of people who were similar. And so this is an experience I've had over and over again in New Brunswick. And I raise it with you because one of the things that I didn't get in and around the Montreal area that I did get when I was here in New Brunswick was a sense of the kindness of the people here. There was a sense of community that I have not seen in other parts of Canada. One of the things that I've done in my work is around suicide and suicide prevention, and we've seen the rise in people with depression and anxiety and suicide across the country. We're the first world, and we have a rising rate of depression. And I would kind of argue that David is not wrong in his idea that we are becoming more and more comfortable in the middle classes that we sit in, that we live in. We have come to expect things as rights. And when those are not, those little patterns that we have laid out in our minds about how our lives will unfold, when those don't happen, or when they do happen and they're not as fulfilling as what we had envisioned when we first started off on our life journey, then we become depressed and we become anxious. And so we see that happening in our society. And I think that one of the ways that we combat that kind of anxiety is by interconnectedness. It's by reaching out to each other and by sharing who we are from our hearts and from our center and from our core. I'm always concerned when I hear about the ways that people share or don't share with each other. One of my experiences in New Brunswick has been the kindness of the people here. But I'll tell you, it's very, very hard to talk deeply with people in New Brunswick. When they say, "Good morning, how are you?" the answer that's expected is, "Fine." If I say, "You know what, I'm having a really rough day," that doesn't go very far. There's a very, very quick movement to erase that. And so there is the danger, and I think that that's what David writes about. I think it's that depth that's hidden, that gets pushed down, that we can cover over with the veneer of this quiet politeness and kindness. And we have to push against that all the time. We have to consistently push against that. At the same time, we have to remember that we still carry it. When you think of yourself, what do you think of when you think of yourself? When you think back to yourself in constructing your identity and your sense of self, are you in the place where you thought you would be at this age? Show of hands, how many people? One. Okay, I want you to come up here and tell us how you got there. I'm joking. I'm not putting you on the spot. The incredible thing about the way lives turn out is that the pictures that we present for ourselves always shift and change. But when you think about who you are, perhaps you have in your mind those people who are around you, those people who take care of you, who you care for. When you're in the presence of your loved one, for instance, you speak and act differently than you do when you're in front of your colleagues or your coworkers or your friends. You act differently in different circumstances. No, you don't.
I'm an emphatic presence of being me and myself and I.
So you have a multi-layered personality that you carry with you all the time. You should come up here as well. This is... No, I'm joking. What's your time, Joe? I was given strict orders to not go over so that you could have some time to speak.
12 after.
Okay, so I have 2 minutes to wrap up. So the thing that I want you to carry away from this is that we have an interplay of two kinds of ways of being in the world. We have a choice. We have ideas around how to be independent and how to construct a social reality around ourselves. When we construct social realities, those can impose strictures on how we function with each other. Those can determine the behavior that we have. We won't go out and wear this dress because Sally thinks it's, it's too young for you to wear. Whereas if we were independent, we might wear this dress. So we are constantly balancing this idea of the independent and the interdependent. And I want to ask you this evening to consider how you do that in your life, and whether, when you are constructing your social identity, you take the time to reveal the part that is truly who you are, and not answer fine when somebody says, how are you doing today? Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you both so much. My name is Joel Mason. The Joel Mason that Agnes mentioned earlier. It's really me. So what we're going to do right now in terms of discussion is I actually want us to start with kind of breaking up the mood a little bit, and to kind of think about, when you have a discussion after some talk, sometimes all this built up stuff of sitting there means that you just kind of, I just want to say something. I want to, and that's where the questions come that aren't questions, that are actually just long opinions, which I'm sure are all amazing and beautiful. But I've been enjoying practicing this technique from a pedagogue where we just take 5 minutes and we turn to your neighbor and talk about what you're thinking about from the stuff you just heard, and then talk about what you might ask, and it's okay if you don't have anything you want to ask, and if one of you does, then you can kind of work on that question and kind of be like, oh, yeah, what would I ask? I'd ask this maybe. Oh, maybe ask like that. Oh, you could add this. Ah, cool. So this is like a way of making this discussion time something where we take a minute to talk to each other about what's hitting us and get that out of our system, and then kind of we'll come back together in 5 minutes and then I'll kind of lead us through that. Does that make sense to everyone? So turn to a neighbor next to you. You've got 5 minutes. Talk about what you're thinking about right now, where you might want to take it. always a good sign when the conversation can't immediately stop. You know, that means stuff was moving, and I know that stuff was definitely moving for me. Hard to hear. Oh, I have the. I had a plan. I have a plan for the microphone. It's called Use It.
It's called.
I was just saying that it's wonderful when the conversation doesn't immediately stop, because that means something's moving, and I definitely felt a lot of wonderful stuff moving from what you both shared with us today. And I hope that your conversations were good as they started out, and you had feels a little bit like the beginning of some kindling lighting on fire, though not a stack of dynamite lighting on fire. That's a crazy story. They saw the dynamite. The thing that I was thinking is that they just set it to the side and kept on working. Didn't go and tell anybody?
They told my grandmother.
Told your grandmother.
My great grandfather, my great uncle. I have the book of arrests, and my great uncle was in jail every second day. Every second day, drunkenness and disturbing the peace, and petty theft. God bless him. And the other guy, my great grandfather, had a stagecoach, and he drove it around, picked up people at the train, drove it around. And my grandmother was a seeker. And to say she didn't care for anyone or whatever, nonsense. Of course she did. She took care of every relative she had, because she was the only one that made money. So she took care of them all. But she, except for Willie, she didn't take. No. She did. She took care of Willie too. But you know, it's just a different world. It's just a different world to. There's a notional knowledge about freedom, and then there's a natural freedom, and the two just are different. And my grandmother fought to be free, as you know, she absolutely had no advantages compared to the most of us have today. It was a different world. So to say her fight for freedom is the same as ours is unwise. That's all. It's just it's an unwise thing.
Yeah, that's well said. And I was struck by something that you said about Gretzky, that he had to quell every doubting Thomas. And I was thinking about what you were saying, Sharon, in terms of like the thing that we might need to become, and the thing we might need to listen to. And I'm thinking about, I guess, experiences of resilience between the different communities that you guys have been a part of. And when we were at dinner, you were talking about some folks that, you know, like you said, you know, they were in jail every other day, or drunk every other day, or both, you know, and then like you turned to your wife and you'd be like, oh, but he was a sweetheart, wasn't he? He was a sweetheart, you know. He should not. And so, and I noticed something. I noticed something in that, I guess, that there is something about what isn't seen in terms of what gets projected out, and I wonder, Sharon, if I could ask you if you have anybody that springs to mind, or a story about someone that you think of, or a quality when you've seen someone whose life experience has been just, I know you've seen so much, and like, damn, you've seen a lot, and then you see something, you're like, oh, but they're a sweetheart. Or what would the equivalent be to you?
Well, I have loads and loads of people, but I'll talk about Chief Robert Joseph, who is a residential school survivor. He went to school for 13 years. He was, it was an Anglican residential school, and he was sexually abused for about 12 of those years. He came out of the school, and he became the first Indigenous newspaper reporter at the Vancouver Sun. And today, he's seen as kind of the de facto father of the reconciliation movement. He was involved in developing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he believes that we can't move forward as a nation until we bring our hearts together in reconciliation. And so how does a person who has gone through that kind of experience when you greet him, the first thing you see is his big smile.
Thank you. And I had one other question that I wanted to ask both of you, and then I'll open it up. And it was about, I want to look at because I thought it was pretty good. However I thought of it. Okay. And also because I think it applies well to what we've heard and what's been shared.
This is the question.
This is the question that I alluded to at dinner, and you were trying to catch me out on it. That's right. And it's about self-determination, and self-determination considered both truly self, individually, the limits of my flesh and bone, or self in terms of the community that you're a part of, whether up in the Miramichi or elsewhere. And the question is this: what is it about the necessity of self-determination that is often not understood from the perspective of a unified and undifferentiated Canada? Which I would just add, in my opinion, that this unified and undifferentiated Canada is the one we always hear about in the national media and from the two main parties, I would say, right? This is the kind of the story. So I'd be really interested in hearing from both of you, what do you think is not understood about self-determination often in this kind of national discourse?
No.
I guess it wasn't that good of a question.
I don't have an answer either, but I have a thought that's around that idea.
Yeah, go for
And
it.
it's not that it's not understood. I think that there's fear around the notion that self-determination might show the cracks in the unity or the unification, or that it might mean the demise of Canada if we have self-determining and sovereign. I'm talking about Indigenous self-determination as nations. So that's where I went. But when you asked the question, the thing that came to mind, Joel, was who are you excluding with the language of that question?
Well, I don't know. No. Who am I excluding with the language of that question? What are you saying?
Probably every rural white boy who worked out in Alberta.
Yeah?
Yeah, of course. I mean, they're the go-to guys that, for better or for worse, and I think it's for worse, are the guys that are scapegoated more than any other in this country. Guys from New Brunswick and Cape Breton and Newfoundland have gone out there to feed their families and are called monsters and destroyers of the world by people like Neil Young, who fly up from Los Angeles in his private jet. And now I admire Neil Young very much, and I admire his work, and I knew his dad. But my son was working out there when he flew up and said that. And my son had a 5-month pregnant woman at home, his wife, in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And my son is every bit as good as Neil Young ever thought of being. Yeah. Okay? And Neil Young wasn't out at minus 30 degrees trying to find piping for water, which my son was doing. Okay? So if I'm going to love anybody, it's going to be my son over him. And so I'll say that rural white boys are the ones that are scapegoated more than any other. Now I know, and I don't know, like our guest here, about the First Nations and how traumatic and horrible it was. And I know that I will never be able to say I do. But I grew up near a tree reserve. I have First Nation nieces and nephews. And I'm perfectly willing for all kinds of reconciliation whenever we can get it. But there's so much finger pointing and scapegoating going on in Canada now. There's too much scapegoating and finger pointing, and it comes from all sides. It's just not finger pointing in one direction, it comes from all sides. The country is extremely divisive. It's divisive on every level. The environmentalists are divisive toward the oil patch. The oil patch people want to separate from Ontario and Quebec. The Maritimes have always been left out. We've been left out since 1867. So to say it's any one thing is wrong. But it's very difficult in an intellectual society to scapegoat intellectuals. And it's very difficult to scapegoat people you rely upon for votes. But it's very...
We live in an intellectual society.
If you visit, and I know this is a poor analogy, but if you visit the Senate You might think that. And you might think that this is where the media, how the media presents its argument. And the media, how the media presents its argument at times can be very divisive too. So all I'm saying is a lot of guys from Cape Breton or the Miramichi, New Brunswick, or Port aux Basques, Newfoundland, really don't get to have a say. That's all, and why I became a senator is so they would have a say. And if I can allow them to have a bit of a say, I'll be happy.
Yeah, and I always make a comment on the fear point, like that fear, self-determination causes fear, in whoever is not asking for the self-determination. And you were applying it in terms of Indigenous reconciliation, but I also thought it fits quite well into the class-based narrative that you were talking about, right? Like I think that, like you said, someone like your grandma is just like, people are like, oh no, don't be like that, with all of its accoutrement of however you act, right? Because that's like a real vault towards self-determination. But it's doing it in the wrong way. You should do it in this way that we should all protect here in the middle, this way of life that looks a certain way, with a certain kind of clothes, makes a certain amount per year.
Well, it's scapegoating. It's the idea that we need to scapegoat the people who are different out of our society in order to retain the status quo in society. And that's gone on for 3,000 years. I mean, take a minute and read the story of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is one of the greatest people in history. She was just a little girl. That's all she was, a little 16-year-old girl. And she raised an army to liberate France and put Charles VII back on the throne. And she put him back on the throne. She put him back on the throne. And then she was captured outside the gates of Paris by the English and their French cohort. And she suffered a trial that was abysmal and a lie from start to finish. And they knew it was a lie. And they burned her at the stake over a lie. That is except for our story of Christ, that is the greatest scapegoating that you can think of in history. And it was to retain the status quo. And Charles VII, they were asked him to write a letter to free her. But he would have to give up some of his territory. And he refused to do it. And he was the one that put her back on she was the one that put him back on the throne. And she was a little girl. And you know what they made fun of her? They made fun of her. You know what the bishops made fun of her over? Because she couldn't read. They laughed at her because she couldn't read and write. They laughed at her because they thought she was ignorant. Okay? So that's happened in our society, and it happens here with scapegoating. And I'm sorry if that becomes my obsession, but that's my obsession now with this parliament. That everyone is pointing fingers and trying to scapegoat one another. And no one can win with reconciliation or anything else like that. You just can't do it.
I'm not sure I understand this concept of scapegoating that you're referring to, David, but I do know that, particularly for Indigenous peoples, that there have been things that have been done that have been abysmal, and it's important to be able to say what those are. And I don't know that that's scapegoating per se. I wouldn't call it scapegoating. I would say it's speaking the truth. And so I'm concerned when we don't want to hear things that are unpleasant to us. And I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but I think that it's important that we're able to...
Not even close,
Okay, good.
Not even close.
So that's what I'm agreeing with you then, because I think that it's important that we are able to continue to speak the truth about what's happened. So I'm misunderstanding your point.
Let me tell you something. And it's the only, it's the last thing I'll say, and it's the only thing I can say. It's about identity politics, which I hate. And I'll tell you why I hate it. I came out of a dance when I was 14. And there was a young Mi'kmaq man, boy, with his date, a little Mi'kmaq girl. And they came out of the dance. And I know his name, and he's rather well known now in the Miramichi, so I'm not going to mention his name. But he was just a kid, and he'd taken his girlfriend to a dance. And a guy came out from the back road. Now, we all have a back road in our community. Have a back road on reserve. You always have a back road. And he was dressed, as we called them back then, scrappers. Okay, he was a scrapper. So he had his boots on to kick someone when he was down. He had rings on his fingers, leather jacket. And he immediately went over to this poor little bugger that was there and going to go and hitchhike home with his girlfriend to Eel Ground. And he started beating him. And the Mi'kmaq girl tried to get in the way, and he threw her out of the way and kept beating this poor guy who couldn't fight. He could not fight back. He didn't know how to fight, which I always think is a great thing. It shows you what his character is. He didn't know how to fight because he never wanted to. Out comes another guy from the back road. Boots on his feet, leather jacket, rings on his fingers, and said, "Leave him alone." This was in 1965, okay? "Leave him alone. The Indian can't fight. He doesn't want to fight." The other guy paid no attention. He said, "Leave him alone. He can't fight. He doesn't want to fight." The guy paid no attention. The other guy from the back row stepped in and beat him silly. And he beat him silly because what he was doing was totally dishonest and dishonorable. It wasn't because one guy was a First Nation, what he was doing is totally dishonorable. But with today's identity politics, both those guys from the back row would be thought to be the same kind of person. They'd both be thought to be the same kind of person with the boots and the jacket and the rings. They'd be looked upon as the same kind of person, but they were totally different. They were a totally different kind of person. One was a bully and a thug, and the other was a man who had honor and wanted to show people respect. Totally different. And I know where they both are now. One became an officer in the army and served overseas most of his life in Afghanistan and other places, and the other guy drank himself to death. And you can decide which is which. So that's all I'm going to say about identity politics. The human heart is the only thing that decides. That's the only thing that decides. Nothing else. Politics can't decide. Our human heart can decide. We can decide what is right and what is wrong and what is honorable and what is truthful. We can decide it. And that's when we can help others. We can't help others if we can't decide that for ourselves. So that's all I got to say. Thank you. I gotta go home.
Take care.
Do you have time to hear this little number we were?
Oh, yeah.
You can if you want.
I'll go sit there.
Yeah, go sit there.
Okay.
You can
Okay.
say long things. Wonderful. I thank both of you guys for jumping into that conversation, and we just went on it so hot and true that we didn't even get to your questions. So we want to end tonight with a song that Agnes mentioned that I'm part of an organization called Dialogue New Brunswick, which is about what both of you were talking about, trying to open up places for dialogue where there isn't for whatever reason, and being able to start sharing your actual experience without having that be something like right away, oh, that's wrong, which is something that you're amazing at actually, Sharon, opening up spaces for people to share things that they feel like in today's divisive world you're not allowed to say, and you're often like, okay, no, go say it, get it out, then we can deal with it, you know. So this song is a song that I wrote that It's about what I appreciate about New Brunswick, which is about that kind of hospitality that you were talking about, David, and something that has deeply affected me. And so I'll teach you the chorus, and we can sing it together. I guess I will continue to use the microphone. And I'm going to ask Dave Warren and Zoe Fitch to help me out. By verbal encouragement before the song.
You're doing great.
Okay.
I love your outfit today.
Yep. Great. I'm gonna sit.
I'm gonna stand.
Great. I'm really grateful for tonight, and thanks. So the chorus is here we go down together and we rise up together. We can make it now, you will see. Out in all kind of weather, we can ride it out together. We can make it now, you will see. Okay, so then it goes like this. And here we go down together, and we rise up together. We can make it now. You will see. Out in all kind of weather, we can ride it out together. We can make it now. You will see. Think you got it? All right, then I'll do the first verse. Kendall, you need to sing very loud. All right. Don't give me your fear. Don't give me your hate. Just come on in here. In fact, you're already a little late. There's already something going on. We already got a rhythm. We already got a song. A song about people living. Ready? Oh, here we go down together, and we rise up together. We can make it now. You will see. Out in all kind of weather, we can ride it out together. We can make it now. You will see. Well, I can feel the fog coming in from the coast. Another politician slog, trying to get for himself the most. Oh, but we know how to make it clear, like the fire put on the kettle. We're all a little different here. Oh, and that's what makes it better. Everybody now, all right. Here we go down together, and we rise up together. We can make it now. You will see. Out in all kind of weather, we can ride it out together. We can make it now. You will see. Living on a tidal river means we know ups and downs. We know the time to give her.
Yeah.
And the time to slow it down. We know the truth our parents taught. stranger in, or it won't be long before you yourself looking for a bed. Oh, here we go down together, and we rise up together. We can make it now. You will see out in all kind of weather. We can ride it out together. We can make it now. You will. One more time, let me hear you. And here we go down together, and we rise up together. We can make it now. You will see out in all kind of weather. We can ride it out together. We can make it now. You will see. We can make it now. We can make it now. You will see.
So people have ferries to catch and rides back to Fredericton. So thank you very much, David.
Oh, you're welcome.
And, right, thank you, Sharon. Thank you very much. Is Lois still in the room? She went to catch the ferry.
Like an eye.
Right. There is a
Sort of like
speaker, an activist, environmentalist,
82
Jim
years
Merkel,
old.
who will be speaking here at 7:30 on Thursday night. Sorry?
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock
Talk
on
about,
Thursday night, and you're all welcome to that. Thank you.
One of the big.